WSDQ Dunlap, WEPG South Pittsburgh, The Copperhead, WSDT Saudi Daisy, Chattanooga.
The viewpoints expressed on LibertyWorks Radio Network are not necessarily those of the network, its affiliates, or sponsors. This is LibertyWorks Radio Network. Now live from coast to coast and around the globe. More real talk, the kind you want, on LibertyWorks Radio Network.
And good afternoon to all of you LibertyWorks Radio listeners out here. This is 5 o'clock Central Time, 6 o'clock Eastern, 3 o'clock Pacific Time. And on this network, at those times on Friday afternoons, you have the Truth Attack Hour. And on Friday afternoons, during the Truth Attack Hour, this show is hosted by two rowdy, rambunctious guys. Number one is me, Larry Becraft. I'm from Huntsville, Alabama. And the other rowdy guy is Shaun O'Connor from California. Shaun, are you with us?
I'm with you guys. Out here. We got a nice day here in California. It's only going 30s this evening, so we're expecting good weather.
Well, hey, Shaun, you're kind of fading in and out. Is there any way you can deal with that problem?
Well, let me try something here. Hang on.
Okay.
How's that?
Oh, that's a lot better.
Okay.
I bet you were using some phone device that made your voice hard to detect.
I'm not giving up any secrets.
Okay, good enough.
Okay.
Hey, folks, I want to extend a warm invitation to all of our listeners this afternoon. Over the next several weeks, hey, look, here it is, the Friday before, 5 days from now, it will be Christmas afternoon. This is the Friday before Christmas. This is December the 20th. December the 22nd, it's going to be the start of winter, which is 2 days from now. What happens right after that? Well, 2 weeks from now, we'll be into the new year. And what happens when the new year comes around? Well, when the new year comes around, you're going to be listening to the radio, you're going to be watching TV, and you're going to have all of these commercials come on. Oh, help us prepare your tax returns. We can do it all. We are H&R Block. And the American people are going to be snowed with all sorts of advertisements that's going to be talking about the filing season. Well, one of the things we like to talk about on this show is we want to educate people about why they're engaged in that activity. Now, today and for the next several weeks, I'm sure as we go through all of January, we're going to be talking about these things. Shaun's going to be talking about specific things. I'm going to be talking about specific things. And our whole purpose is to educate people about the tax laws, which is something that a lot of people know very little about. Now, during the course of this afternoon's program, one of the things I'm going to be getting into is some information that is posted over on my website. Now, to get to my website, all you have to do is, I've got two websites. One is for my office, law office. That's LarryBecraft.org. Don't go there because there's legal information that is not posted on that website. I have a separate website that is posted on my internet service provider. Now, and the URL is real odd for that. So the way you will get to this website, which is the Dixieland Law Journal, what you will do is simply type in into an internet search engine. Don't use Google. Type in Becraft Briefs. And when you get over there to the front page of the Dixieland Law Journal, on the front page there's just some links to some other topics. I'm really interested in the money issue. There's a link to a page that's got a lot of money issue materials. There's a page that goes over to a lot of, important, a page that will provide links to the entire United States statutes at large, a lot of information about other legal topics, and things that I think people that are concerned about the course and direction of American society, if you want some legal tools to help you in that battle, I've got them posted over on my website. I've also got a page called Federal Jurisdiction. I've got one on the Second Amendment. But what I'm talking about this afternoon is a link off the front page of the Dixieland Law Journal to another page called Taxation. Now, Shaun and I do a show on Wednesday nights, and this last Wednesday night, and of course today's show is going to be kind of a repeat of what we covered during the Wednesday night separate show. On that separate Wednesday night show, I was using this website, this page on my website, and I quickly, as I was talking to the people that were participating in this conference call, a video conference call called Zoom, I found out that even though I have attended to making links on these pages on my website, as late as October, a lot of them had gone bad. So now I'm going to tell our listeners I am in the process, and I have done a lot today, and I'll be doing it over the remainder of the weekend. I am correcting a bunch of links on my old Tax Acts and Regulations page that comes off of the taxation page of my website. So if you want to get information, a problem that I only recently discovered was bad links. Well, those bad links are being cleared up right now. Now, what I would like to, if you're listening to this program and want to get a foundation for understanding something about the tax laws, I would direct your attention to, and this is what I want to talk about during this program, there's a page on my taxation page, a link to another page called Old Tax Acts and Regulations. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that during the course of the program. But in the interim, I want to ask Shaun some questions. Shaun, hasn't this tax movement been interested in the issue of what is income? And haven't there been a number of arguments made that relates to that topic?
Oh, tremendously so. Good and bad.
Well, does it help to, what were some of the good arguments and what were some of the bad arguments that you encountered over the last several decades?
Well, the best arguments that I've encountered is actually being able to identify and define income the way Congress and the Supreme Court has identified it as a profit and gain, which comes from a particular source. The bad arguments that I have seen are legal arguments that are developed after someone either reads an article or scrutinizes just the Internal Revenue Code and says, wow, you know what, doesn't look like wages are income, and so we're going to waltz into court and say wages aren't income, and leave the argument at that. The problem that has developed is the argument has been incomplete, to say the very least, and left open to wide definition by the courts, which has resulted in a lot of bad case law.
Well, isn't it real important, if you're going to be developing legal arguments, instead of relying upon and developing an argument based upon something you read in the newspaper, isn't it beneficial to actually rely upon and have access to and use legal materials like statutes and regulations?
Well, there's no question about it. If you take a look at the majority of the tax codes or a great deal of the tax code sections, you'll find that the Internal Revenue, or the legislature has enacted all kinds of statutes relating to income taxes and various other taxes, which they'll tell you right inside the statute that these will be governed by regulations. In fact, when you go to the Internal Revenue Code under Title 26, 7805, they'll tell you right there and then that the Secretary of the Treasury has the authority to write regulations to explain the statutes that Congress has written. And those regulations are very, very important because, in essence, they are supposedly explaining to the people what the statute Congress has written means.
That is so true. Now, here's what I want to tell our listeners. All of this, the everything you want to know about the growth, I guess is a good word to describe. We've had the growth, this huge growth in the federal income tax laws. That growth has taken place since 1913 and 1916. Now, if you want to have access to the old Tax Acts and Regulations, you will find them on my website. Now, on my website, you'll find a collection of legal information relating to the income tax that will be found on no other website on the Internet. Nobody else has come along and has posted the old tax acts that are PDF images that you can download, and they are word searchable. And nobody else has even posted the regulations for these old tax acts. And what I want to do this afternoon is, I have found that kind of repeating topics, beating a topic into the heads of people is worthwhile. It's worthwhile to repeat until it becomes extremely familiar, a lot of these tax topics. And the best way I know to increase the familiarity of a lot of people with this old stuff is to constantly discuss it. Now, I've been in court, and, I've asked some IRS agents on the stand, you've got some expert, and I'll come along and say, well, gee, this party acts like they know everything about the income tax. One of the things they don't know is anything about the history. You can ask your tax accountants, the guys that really have been, highly educated about income taxation. Do they know anything about the history of the income tax? No. You can ask your tax lawyers. Do they know anything about the old tax acts and regulations? Well, the answer there again is no. You can have an IRS agent on the witness stand in a federal criminal trial in court, and I can ask him, well, gee, do you know anything about Regulation 77? And they will say, I've never heard of that. Well, now all of this information is available on the Internet. It's on my website, and you can read it. Now, here's something that the reason why I think all of this is real important. Shaun and I were talking about it at the start a few minutes ago about, income. Have there been various arguments about income? Now, regulations are real important. And unless you dig into the old regulations on this point, you're going to be really missing a lot. And the reason I say that is in 1916, Congress comes along and passes a Revenue Act of 1916. Followed the following year, Revenue Act of 1917. Followed thereafter by the Revenue Act of 1918. And Congress would come along and all these old tax acts, just like they do today, and they come out with, some very broad, vague wording. Like the definition of income in the old, statutes was, gross income means the gains, profits, and income derived from wages, salaries, and compensation for personal services. Now, you can use some rules of statutory construction, and you will reach this conclusion. There's something different between wages, salaries, and compensation for services. That's something a little bit different from gains, profits, and income. Why do I say that? Because that's the way the statute was written. Now, the Commissioner of Internal Revenue was the guy that was charged with the administration and enforcement of these old tax acts. And so when Congress comes along and passes these broadly worded statutes, since he's got maybe 20 or 30,000 people that are working for him, they all have to be on the same page regarding the meaning of some word. And so from the very beginning, the Commissioner of Internal Revenue and the Secretary of the Treasury, they've gotten together, and every time Congress comes along and passes one of these old tax acts, the Commissioner and the Secretary would get together and come out with a set of regulations, and those regulations would be kind of like a book. Some of them 200, 300, 400, 500 pages long. And the reason why they publish these regulations is the primary purpose was to get uniformity of meaning for everybody that was involved in the administration and enforcement of the income tax. And that's the reason why you will come along and say, like for the Revenue Act of 1918, the Commissioner will come out with a booklet that's 300 or 400 pages long called the Regulations 45 for the Revenue Act of 1918. Now, Shaun, I'm wondering about our first break because I've got 5:14 and I've heard no music coming on.
Oh, we're close then.
Oh, there it is.
Okay.
Hey, folks, after this short break, we'll be back with the remainder of the program. Stay tuned. is the second segment of today's program where I'm trying to educate our listeners about the structure of the old tax laws and the regulations. Now, let me get into a kind of a description of these old tax acts and regulations. And if you really want to, after you listen to this program, if you want to know a little bit more, go over to my website, which is the Dixieland Law Journal, and on the front page, click on the link to the taxation page. And then when you get over to the taxation page, right at the very top it says Old Tax Acts and Regulations. That's another page, and you can click on that. And now you will have access to the raw data. This is real important, the raw data. And once you have access to this raw data, and you can eliminate the stuff that's not important and focus in on what is important, you will learn a whole lot. And you'll see a lot more clearly how the federal tax laws have been built. Now, let me quickly go over during this next segment. I want to introduce in chronological order the way these tax acts came about. And then after that is done, I want to tie it all together. And the reason why it's real important to know something about the old tax acts is because of this principle of law. The Supreme Court has said, and rightly so, I mean, this is correct, that, when you're looking at a field of law, even the old and repealed materials that relate to that field of law provides meaning. And you once you really dig into the tax stuff, that is crystal clear. The old stuff provides meaning. Now, let me summarize for you. The people that need an introduction to this stuff, the best way to do it is to just talk about the big, broad picture. And the big, broad picture about the the history of the income tax is that there's a series of acts of Congress that relate to the federal income tax, and then there's also a series of regulations that have been adopted to provide meaning to those various revenue acts. Now, let me just quickly summarize them for you. In 1913, Congress comes along after the alleged ratification of the 16th Amendment, and in October of 1913, it passes the first income tax act under the 16th Amendment. And if you want to read that 1913 act, you can go over to this page, the Old Tax Acts and Regulations on my website, and you can click on the link to the 1913 act, and a PDF image of that act will come up. Now, as a result of the 1913 act being promulgated, there was a company called the Union Pacific Railroad, and it started implementing against a guy by the name of Frank Brushaber, the provisions of the 1913, 1914, the 1913 Act in 1913, 1914, 1915. Well, Frank Brushaber got a little bit irritated, just like what happened decades before in the Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust case. Frank Brushaber engaged in a lawsuit challenging the meaning and construction of both the 16th Amendment and the 1913 Act. And if you want to read, nobody else has got this on any other website. If you want to read the Brushaber briefs, and as well as the decision itself, this page provides links to all of that. It's very educational. But here's the point I want to make. Typically in the past, Congress has come along when, let's say back in 1909, Congress comes along and passes a tax bill applying to foreign-built yachts. And that tax, the constitutionality of it, went up to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found that to be constitutional. And right after that, periodically, now that the Supreme Court said this tax is constitutional, what Congress would typically do is that periodically, every 2 years or over a certain time frame, fairly frequently, Congress would come along and pass a tax in lieu of Well, the in lieu of feature is real important for the income tax, and when that starts is real important. In reference to the federal income tax, rather than basing everything on the 1913 Act, in 1916, as a result of the Supreme Court's decision in the Bruchaber case, the Congress of the United States comes along and repeals completely the 1913 Act, and then they come out in September of 1916 with the Revenue Act of 1916, which imposed the income tax. Now, on this page of my website, if you want to be able to read the 1916 Act and the Act that amended it in 1917, all you have to do is click on the links right there on the page. Now, after the 1916 and 1917 Acts were adopted by Congress, starting in 1918, Congress comes along and they're doing what they've done typically in the past. They're enacting a tax act that is in lieu of one that was previously imposed. So the 1916 and 1917 Acts imposed the tax for if you're connecting it all together, if you want to see the stream, the constant stream, the interconnected stream of all the tax acts, it goes back to the 1916 Act. That's where it was imposed, and since 1916, all these tax acts have been imposed in lieu of the previous tax. So the foundation for the federal income tax today is not the 1913 Act, but instead it is the 1916 Act. So starting in 1918, Congress comes along and says, well, in the lieu of the tax imposed in 1916 and 1917, we hereby impose this tax. Now, if you want to be able to read the 1918 Act as well as the corresponding regulations, they are linked. You can pull up PDF images off of this page on my website. Well, the Revenue Act of 1918 was in effect for a couple of years, and then Congress comes along and in 1921 comes out with what they typically do. They passed the Revenue Act of 1921, and it imposed a tax in lieu of the tax imposed by the Revenue Act of 1918, which imposed a tax in lieu of the tax imposed by the 1916 and 1917 Act. Now, let's kind of get around to the meat of the matter. When every 2 years, virtually, Congress would come along and impose an income tax, and it would always be in lieu of. So by the time you get up to 1926, and let's say it's 1927, you're looking at the federal income tax laws, you're looking at the 1926 Act, and the tax imposed section 210, it would read, well, in lieu of the tax imposed previously in the 1924 Act, there is hereby imposed this tax. And of course, once Congress enacted the Revenue Act of 1926, the Commissioner and the Secretary of the Treasury, they get together and they got to come out with a big old thick book to provide their view of the meaning of the various provisions of the Revenue Act of 1928. That set of regulations is Regulation 69. And you can download all this stuff, and it's all PDF images that are word searchable. Now, here's something that happened that, this is the reason why I'm saying you need to know something about the old stuff and know the little tricks that have been engaged in. In 1928, Congress comes along and enacts the Revenue Act of 1928. Now, when you take a look at the tax imposed section of the Revenue Act of 1928, it doesn't say anything about the tax being imposed in lieu of the previous tax. Oh, but it's still there. What Congress did starting in 1928 is they took out the in lieu of feature that had been present in the 1926, the 1924, 1921, the Revenue Act of 1918. It was there in the tax imposed section, but now Congress simply takes that in lieu of feature out of the tax imposed section, which is now Section 11, and they stick it over into Section 63. So, and all this is done for a specific reason. This was done all the way up through the Revenue Act of 1938. The Revenue Act of 1938 it had a Section 11 that imposed the tax. But unless you went back and took a look at Section 63, you wouldn't know that the Revenue Act, the tax imposed by the Revenue Act of 1936, was one that was in lieu of the tax imposed by the Revenue Act of the Revenue Act of 1938 imposed a tax in lieu of the tax imposed by the Revenue Act of 1936. When you go back to the Revenue Act of 1936, you find out that was a tax imposed in lieu of the tax imposed by the Revenue Act of 1934, ad nauseum all the way back to 1928. Now, I'm kind of quickly going over this, but I'm at least telling you about these big, broad features so that when you go over to this page on my website, it'll now that you're starting to look at it, you've had it explained to you, and now when you start looking at it, you can see what happened. It's been previously explained. You can now have a real good idea about what you're looking at. Now, in 1939, Congress comes along and at that stage, you had all these tax acts on a wide variety of things, on income, on estates and gifts, on employments, on tires over 40 pounds, over gambling, over firearms, over booze, over gasoline, over chassis on cars, even white phosphorus matches. There was a tax imposed on white phosphorus matches. But all of those acts were scattered throughout the statutes at large. So what Congress did in early 1939 is it passed a law. All of the tax acts that were scattered throughout, all the United States statutes at large, they were all brought together into one act of Congress. And that one act of Congress was called the 1939 Internal Revenue Code, where they brought together everything. All the then existing tax acts were put into one act of Congress, and the old tax acts that were included in the 1939 Internal Revenue Code, all the old stuff, that was repealed. And that's the way they created the 1939 Internal Revenue Code. Now, here's something that people need to know something about. But by means of the Revenue Act of 1938, that tax had been imposed in lieu of the tax imposed by the Revenue Act of 1936. The Revenue Act of 1936 imposed a tax in lieu of the tax imposed by the Revenue Act of 1934. The Revenue Act of 1934 imposed a tax in lieu of the tax imposed by the Revenue Act of 1932. The Revenue Act of 1932 imposed a tax in lieu of the 28 tax, which was in lieu of the 26 tax, which was in lieu of the 24 tax, which was in lieu of the 21 tax, which was in lieu of the tax imposed by the Revenue Act of 1918, which was in lieu of the 1916 and 1917 tax. It's all connected, but there's a reason why this is done. Once you understand this, you can take something that's a very limited tax, but if you engage in this in lieu of, by subsequent acts, always in lieu of the previous thing, over time, you will make a very limited tax appear to be bigger than it really is. And the only way that you can really see the real size of a particular law is to get back into the history of all this stuff. Now, the 1939 Internal Revenue Code that encompassed all of the old tax acts, everything that was then in effect was stuck into this one code. Well, that code, it got amended all the way up through August of 1954. And in August of 1954, Congress comes along and enacts the Internal Revenue Code of 1954. Well, what is the Internal Revenue Code of 1954? Well, imagine what the Internal Revenue Code of 1939 looked like in August of 1934. Take whatever that document is and cut up the sections. And folks, there's the music coming on, letting us know we got our last break. Folks, after a few short minutes, we'll be back with a closing segment. Stay tuned. And Shaun and I are back for the final segment of this afternoon's edition of the Truth Attack Hour on this Friday before Christmas. Now, during the first two segments of this program, I've been going kind of a little bit faster than probably is good for this. I'm trying to cram in a whole lot. I direct if you're really wanting to know something about the federal income tax laws, and I know that there's a lot of people that don't care to know anything about it, but there are those that do. And having access to just the raw information is real important. And you can get the raw information over on my website. My website is the Dixieland Law Journal. And when you get to the front page of the Dixieland Law Journal, after you find that website through an internet search engine, go down to the page that's labeled taxation. There's a link to a taxation page. And that'll carry you over to a separate page that's got a lot of information. It's got another page that's devoted to providing all access to all the old tax acts and regulations. And then there's a lot of explanations right here. I have a page that just deals with this in lieu of feature. What I've been talking about during the course of this program, this in lieu of feature that you probably have never heard about. Well, once you get exposed to something like this, that's the way I learn. I can be exposed to something that I know nothing about. And when I hear it, at that moment, I know nothing about it. But, once you get exposed to it and start looking at it, then it becomes something that's familiar to you, and you begin the process of learning. Now, you are learning something by listening to this program. You're learning a little something about it. There's something significant. There's something real important to digging into the old tax acts and regulations, which are provided on this website. And everything is connected. It's in lieu of. Now, right before the break, I was talking about the 1939 Internal Revenue Code. And the 1954 Code comes along and replaces the 1939 Code. And right before the break, I was talking about how, imagine taking the 1939 Internal Revenue Code, the way it looked in August of 1954, and cut it up. Cut up take scissors to that big, thick book and cut up the sections. And then a lot of the sections, cut up the sections into subsections. You're doing it with a pair of scissors. And then shuffle that mess of, bits and pieces of paper that you've got, shuffle it like a deck of cards. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what the 54 Code is. The 54 Code is nothing more than the rearranged 1939 Code. Now, what is today, the 1986 Internal Revenue Code, what in the world is that? Well, if you go back to that law that created the 1986 Internal Revenue Code, it would just simply say, the 1954 Code, its name is changed to 1986 Code. So that's all the 86 Code is. It's nothing more than the renamed 54 Code. Well, what is the 1954 Code? Well, the 1954 Code is a codification of all of the federal tax laws. All the tax laws are contained in that one code. And there's a whole bunch of taxes in that one code. Subtitle A's got the income tax. Subtitle B's got the estate and gift tax. Subtitle C's got the employment taxes. Subtitles D and E deal with a lot more miscellaneous taxes, including taxes on firearms and booze and everything else. We're concerned about the income tax. It's in Subtitle A. Well, where does Subtitle A of the 1954 Internal Revenue Code come from? Well, it comes from the income tax sections in the 1939 Code. Well, how was the 1939 Code created? Well, the income tax provisions in the 1939 Code came from the Revenue Act, the income tax provisions of the Revenue Act of 1938. So when you look at the Revenue Act of 1938, well, you find out that that tax was imposed in lieu of the tax imposed by the Revenue Act of 1936. And when you go back to the Revenue Act of 1936, you'll find, when you look at the tax imposed section and Section 63, you will find that, well, that was the tax imposed in lieu of the tax imposed by the Revenue Act of 1934. Now, let me just, here's what happens. From 1938, you go back to the 1936 tax. From the 36 tax, you go back to the 34 tax. From the 34 tax, you go back to the 32 tax. From the 32 tax, you go back to the 28 tax. From the 28 tax, you go back to the 26 tax. From the 26 tax, you go back to the 24 tax. From the 24 tax, you go back to the 21 tax. From the 21 tax, you go back to the Revenue Act of 1918, which imposed the tax in lieu of the tax-imposed sections of the Revenue Acts of 1916 and 1917. Whew, isn't that a mess? But it's real important to, it's not difficult to learn, that everything's in lieu of. And there's a page on my taxation page that kind of explains this in lieu of feature. Now, what's important for students of the federal income tax is to not deal with the minutia of the ever-expanding over a period of time, the administrative features of the income tax. Like dealing with deductions and all of that complicated stuff. What's most important for the average American is, well, who is encompassed within this? This tax imposed on individuals. Who in the world is that? And seeing, just if you limit your study, ignore, the complicated and sections that are not worth even looking at, that deal with, how the tax operates in reference to deductions and credits. And, once you cast that all aside, just looking at tax imposed is very educational. And that's what I'm encouraging our listeners to do. Now, over the weekend, you maybe you're through with doing all your shopping. You're ready for Christmas. Well, I would invite you to go over to my website and click on the taxation page and become familiar with, just take a look at the old tax acts and regulations page, and become familiar with, hey, once you see the acts and the regulations, and they're there, and you pull them up, you download them, and look at them, hey, it's just words on paper. And then once you know about the background of the tax acts, then you can get into other things that I've talked about on my taxation page. You can study this in lieu of feature. You can deal with there's a good treatment about what is income. Now, this is real important. You will not learn, this is a big problem with everybody. Tax professionals or just those that are curious about the tax laws. If you don't know the old stuff that relates to income, and if you limit your study to just the current definitions, like Section 61 of the Internal Revenue Code, dividing gross income, if you ignore the old stuff, if you're completely unaware of it, you will never have an appreciation and understanding of what really income is. You can only find out what income is by looking at the old stuff, and that's not all that difficult. Shaun, would you agree? I don't know how much you've done in the way of digging around in the old stuff, but I want to ask this question. Do you think it's difficult for just the average American, if they dig around and just devote some time to looking at the fundamentals of this stuff, they can come away with an understanding of it?
It's not difficult at all, and yes, they can. And the time that we used to have to devote to it, because we had to run through the law libraries, as you have said, Larry, have been diminished greatly because it's all sitting there, and so much of it, if not all of it's on your website. I'd like to remind the listeners of something also, too. Historical analysis, history in and of itself of how this came about is as important as your individual rights. If you think about it, if you don't understand, and you've never read the Declaration of Independence or the Magna Carta or the United States Constitution, you don't understand why you have individual rights, and a lot of people in this world don't. History is fundamentally important to understanding what's happening with the income tax.
So true, so true. Very, very, very good. Now, I will go a step further. There's something that's real important regarding the employment taxes. And if you don't know, if all you do in reference to the employment taxes is look at the current stuff, you will completely miss who it applies to. You will only find out about how the employment taxes operates and who is imposed on by looking at the old stuff. Now, on my taxation page, I've got a link to another page called Employment Taxes. And let me just come to a real quick conclusion in reference to employment taxes. In 1918, the only parties that were, let's say you had somebody that was working and being paid wages. An American here in the United States was not subject to withholding on his employment. The only parties who were subject to withholding on what they made in the form of wages, the only ones that were subject to that was non-resident aliens and foreign corporations. Isn't that absolutely amazing? And most people, I guarantee you, your tax professionals, whether they be an accountant or a tax lawyer, they don't know anything about that. But if you go back and take a look at, and I explain this on a page called Employment Taxes, that's a link to another page is off the taxation page. You know, all you have to do is read this page, and I give you the sections of the Revenue Act in question and the articles and the regulations, and you can look at, it's not difficult to read the sections dealing with withholding and the tax acts, and as well as the regulations that are specifically identified. It doesn't take it may take you some time to read all this stuff, but after you get through with it, you will find that all the way up through 1939, the parties that were subject to wage withholding, and I'm sure there were some foreign corporations that got wages paid, through depending on the setup that might happen, but by and large, wage withholding only applied to non-resident aliens. That is something that is absolutely amazing. And
you know what, Larry? Larry, what's great about that, too, is if you go back even further and further into history, it becomes clear why that was the case. This idea of the way this taxation works, foreign individuals and entities, is not new. I mean, this goes back to history a long ways.
Yeah. There's some very Supreme Court, real important Supreme Court cases. Like the tax on aliens as they get off the ship, the tax on the head tax. And the head tax decision, to me, that's almost as important as, the Pollock case and the Brushaber case. The case where the Supreme Court says, oh, yeah, we can impose a head tax on aliens. Oh, that is so blooming important.
Yes.
But people don't know it.
Indeed.
Hey, Shaun, we're almost to the end of the program. Our listeners need to know a little something about how they can get in touch with or get over to your website.
Well, all they have to do is get over to my website, is type into whatever browser you are on, and type in ShaunO'Connor.org. That's ShawnO'Connor.org. My website's available, which has various links to other websites, including Larry's, by the way. I'm not going to try to duplicate what Larry has done, because what he has done is amazing. But that's the best way to contact me, and that gives all the contact information I have.
And what's your observation about, the people that are wanting to dig into this stuff and learn something about it? In the past, there's been a lot of hawkers and con men out there, haven't there been?
There've been a tremendous amount, and it's really hard when you begin looking at this to determine what you're hearing is whether it has any basis or it doesn't, and whether there's any kind of history behind it. But what I encourage people to do is go ahead and read anything that's out there, but don't take it for granted, not for a minute. Check it, recheck it, do your own research, and I can't emphasize enough that Larry's website is so loaded with so much information. That is not opinion. It is the law.
Hey, Shaun, I'm going to have to cut you off because I hear in the background, isn't that the music? Yeah, the music here. Hey, folks, we have reached the end of another program. Hey, Shaun, have a Merry Christmas.
You do.